Okay, today we're going to move to the other edge of Europe. We had spent the last two sessions looking at Italian art, which, as we mentioned, was driven by the Counter-Reformation. Now we're going to move to the northernmost part of Europe into the Netherlands and see how the Baroque takes a very different form in the Netherlands. And as I tell my students, it's probably better to think of the 1600s, the 17th century, as not as the Baroque period, but of the Baroque's period with an S at the end, because during this period, there were really national styles emerged for the first time. So there was a very distinctively Italian art, the way we've been looking at, but also distinctively French art and distinctively English art and Spanish art and so forth. And the Netherlands are my favorite of the Baroques. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at what I sometimes have been called the Little Dutch Masters, which does not mean cigars, even though they were marketed that way, or with that Rembrandt, if you remember those cigars, with the Rembrandt syndics of the cloth guild on the cover. But these are different Little Dutch Masters. And we call them the Little Dutch Masters because there is this great Rembrandt and Vermeer, but then there are hundreds and hundreds of others, because the Dutch art market during the 1600s was very, very hot, and art was very lucrative, and whole fortunes were made by artists. So it was a wonderful place to practice your trade, and there was a booming art market, and it was a very, very prosperous economy. And these all combine to make a wonderful milieu for the embodiment of art. Now, last time we had looked at the Catholics, and we had seen that their art was driven by the Counter-Reformation. That is, by propagating the Catholic faith, especially up against its new contender in Northern Europe, Protestantism, which had by 1600s not only taken over Northern Germany with Luther, but also Switzerland, parts of France, England, and the Netherlands. They had all become Protestant. And it was not only a spiritual crisis for the Catholics, it was also a financial crisis, because now the money that used to be coming from England, Germany and France and the Netherlands, now there was none. So now, despite this, the Catholics launched a magnificent show of art, because, as we said, the Protestants were suspicious of art. They were kind of iconoclastic. And so the Catholics seized on this and used art to excite the emotions. And they were, in Italy anyway, very influenced by the new art form of the time, opera. And here's a Bernini statue of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, with the angel plunging his fiery sword into her heart, bringing her to higher and higher levels of ecstasy. So we had seen that the Catholics had a kind of mystical approach to art. It was incarnational, because Catholicism and Christianity in general has this idea of Jesus being this mediator, this incarnation of God. And so they actually saw art as kind of an incarnation of the divine. They don't call that incarnation, they call it sacramental. And among the Greek Orthodox, they call it mysterium. Right, the mysteries, the sacraments. And art was one of these sacramental things that bridged the gamut between the invisible God on the one hand and our own world, and not only our own world, but our own world as mediated by Jesus and by the angel in this and by the saints and all that sort of stuff. So the Catholics used the drama of the opera to give form to a propagandistic art. And I don't mean that in a negative way. We think of propaganda sometimes as bad, but they were propagating the Catholic faith, which they very truly believed in. Now, there was, however, a dark side to the Catholic Baroque Counter-Reformation, and that is the Inquisition. The Inquisition that took hold, especially in Spain. And of course, we've heard of torturing and all these sorts of horrible things that went on in the name of converting people. However, they weren't really mostly trying to seize on Protestants, because Protestantism being banned in Spain, there weren't many Protestants. And if they were very, very, very secretive about it, because they would be subject to this. But the Inquisition was more geared toward the people in Spain that had been the Islamic people and the Jewish people that had lived there. Because a lot of us forget that in Spain, during the Middle Ages, it was an Islamic country, except for just the very top, the very northernmost part of Spain by Santiago de Compostela, which was a big pilgrimage center. But the vast majority of the peninsula was ruled by the Caliph. And it was only in 1492 that Catholicism restated itself in Spain. And unlike the Muslims that had been there before, that were very tolerant and allowed Christians and allowed Jews, and sometimes Jews rose to very high positions of power in Spain, like Maimonides, the physician and philosopher that became one of the inner circle of the Caliph during the Middle Ages. But this was to be no more during the Inquisition of the Counter-Reformation. And here's something interesting. The Maurice Ghost, those were Muslims who converted, because they saw that you can convert, or you can leave, or you can be killed. And so under pain of conversion, many Muslims converted. Muslims already accept Jesus, so maybe that wasn't such a unbridgeable gap. And the Jews that converted to Catholicism, they called them conversos. And then they also had another name, Moranos, and this means pigs. And that's why I put quotation marks around it. It's a very nasty word to use. But what it meant is secret Jews. Jews who they became baptized and they went to church and all that. But on Friday night, they closed the shutters, and they lit the candles and they did the blessings for the Sabbath. So they continued secretly to practice Judaism, although outwardly they were good Catholics and sent their kids to Sunday school and everything like that. But secretly, they believed in that. So, and in fact, in the service of Yom Kippur, there's a special prayer for those who have made these kinds of vows that otherwise would be seen as a betrayal or as a sin, but under these conditions, it was allowed. And so there's a whole prayer for those who must remain secret. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting kind of background. So this is going on in the Catholic Church. Beyond this, all this wonderful mystical operatic propaganda, there's also this very sinister and dark side of torturing people for Christ. Okay, now, you look in the interior of St. Peter's, and it is rich. It is double Dutch chocolate cake with raisins and nuts and honey and marshmallows and everything. And it's somewhat almost say overdone. And of course, the interior was designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the great Italian architect. But I want to contrast this very, very decorated, very lush, very, very rich, very, very opulent interior to the interior of a Dutch church from the same period. Now, actually, that's a misnomer. It's actually a church from the Middle Ages. It's a Gothic church, but it had been repurposed and redecorated by the, if you call that decoration, by the Protestants. That is, they removed the statues, smashed the statues, smashed the stained glass windows, put in clear windows. They plastered over any murals or frescoes. They took down tapestries. They took away the candles. They took away the altar. They took away the elaborate ritual costumes and stuff, and they stripped it down to this incredibly pure kind of a thing. And when I was in graduate school, I was lucky enough to teach in Germany, in southern Germany. It's very, very, very Catholic. And during the break between summer 1 and summer 2, I taught 2 semesters over there. It was a wonderful program. It really helped my German. But I went to Amsterdam on the train along the Rhine. It's a beautiful trip to call it, because we were in southern Germany, right on the Swiss border by Lake Constance. And I was ready not to like these churches. I thought this is a desecration of art, and I love them. I walked into that Neue Kirche and I just thought reason. order, simplicity, beauty. I think especially as someone who is really a 20th century modernist, steeped in Bauhaus kind of aesthetic of less is more and sort of a pure functionalism, I think that these are just, they really hit a resonance with me that I liked very much, and I was very surprised how much I liked it. So I'm not advocating the destruction of art, but this is just how it was. And there was a whole genre of painters. This is Emmanuel de Witt, that just did church interiors, specialized just in church interiors, painting church interiors. This is a painting of the, I didn't mean he decorated the church. Now, these Protestants were not Lutherans, they were Calvinists. And this is John Kelvin. He was not a priest, but Luther was a priest and a monk. Kelvin was a lawyer, and he had considered the priesthood, and he studied in France, and he became convinced of the rightness of Luther, but he felt that he didn't go quite far enough. And so he felt that all tradition is just made up. And sola scriptura, only by the Bible, only by those books in the Bible, that's the only thing we're going to use. We're not going to have sacraments, we're not going to have elaborate music, we're not going to have rituals, we're not going to have paintings, just the Bible, the word, right? Kind of idea of it. Now, he came up with these other ideas too. And I'm telling you this not because it's a religion class or anything, because this really is the art theory of this period. If you're going to really crack and really understand this period from within its own discourse of the 17th century, you have to be familiar with these ideas. Doesn't mean you have to believe in them, right? So I'm just presenting them because that's the context in which it's made. And this is, the same way that for the Impressionists, remember when we looked at a couple of years ago here, they had used modern science, the physics of light, the science of optics and sensation and perception, and they used that science as the basis of their theory of Impressionism. And the surrealists used Freudian psychology of their time as a structure on which they built their theory. Well, the theory of this period is really theology. And so we see that art takes on these theological values as we had seen in Catholics. Okay, so Calvin went farther and he believed in predestination, which is that the idea that if God knows everything, he also knows the future. So he knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. And there's the elect and there's the damned. And there's nothing you can do about it because of predestination. Even before God thought about, even before he started creating the world, you were either destined to be the elect or the damned, and you better hope that you're the elect and not the damned. Now, along with this came another idea, was innate moral depravity, that our own being was so tainted by original sin that that left to our own devices, we just devolve into these animalistic beings. And the basic idea here was if it feels good, it must be bad. Because remember the idea of the fall of man from Adam and Eve. They ate that apple of the knowledge of, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And then they had to face death and suffering and so forth. Now, Kelvin very mistrusted any of the instinctual drives of human beings. He felt that those led to perdition, that they were an expression of this original sin and rebellious against God. And that, so for example, wine feels good. So it's better not to drink too much, maybe just a sip at communion time, right? Sex feels good. Only missionary position, only with your spouse, only for not for fun, just for reproduction strictly, right? Because otherwise one could fall into moral depravity. And so if it feels good, it must be bad, because the body is sort of tainted by this sinful nature that's always going to be depraved unless we believe in the way he does. Okay, so vices, this all comes down to that there are these, we are afflicted with these various vices: gambling, drinking too much, womanizing, anything like that, eating too much, right? Okay, now, just it is an atonement theology. We are morally depraved, but if we believe in Jesus and his death, it's most important his death, then we're atoned with God, and God is then satisfied, right? Predestination, all this is very different than the Catholic thing, because the Catholics believe in free will, and they don't believe in predestination. So even God doesn't know what's happening in the future. And in this sense, Catholicism is kind of closer to Judaism in that insistence on free will and the ability of people to change their mind and do that. But Kelvin felt it was already figured out beforehand. So what we must do is we must all act, we all hope that we're elect, because we all have moments of sin and depravity, and we hope that God doesn't strike us dead at that moment and we're the dead. So we always all have to act. Okay, so that's Calvinist, very hardcore Protestantism, right? And although he preached for a while in Strasbourg, he later settled in Geneva and really established a theocracy. That is a rule by presbyters, by his churchmen. You see, Kelvin not only rethought out Christian salvation according to this atonement thing, but he also changed the structure of the church. So instead of having bishops who ordained priests, there were presbyters, elders that were considered wise, and they sort of made the ministers out of it. Okay, so it was a theocracy. And Calvinist theocracy was kind of brutal in some ways, because there were pillories, there were heavy fines. One man, for example, had named his dog Kelvin, and he was thrown in prison, and the dog was killed. Right, so it was a strict theocracy. Now, in paper, it was supposed to be separation of church and state, but it actually wasn't. Okay, so let's get to art. This was all preamble to talking about Dutch art, because the Netherlands became Protestant. They broke away from Flanders, also in the Netherlands, which is basically Belgium now, and they embraced a liberal form of Calvinism. Now, the strict Orthodox Calvinism is like what I was saying in Geneva. However, in certain states, Holland was a confederation of different, the Netherlands, Holland was the most prominent of them. There were these different states. There was a liberal, sort of tolerant Calvinism. The state church was definitely Calvinist. But if you wanted to practice Catholicism, if you wanted to be a Lutheran, you wanted to be a Unitarian, you could do that. And especially this religious pluralism was rampant in Amsterdam, the capital. Here is some iconoclast smashing statues. It's a little out of sequence, but I wanted to show you of these churches, which are beautiful. Now, I was trying to find a picture of the altar, because one of the interesting things is that, Catholics have a high altar, it's all set up and this rich coverings and candlesticks and so forth. And this is just a plain wooden table. And I remember seeing one in one of these churches in Amsterdam, and it said, and you could kind of read it because it's very close to English and German, but do this in remembrance of me, sort of inscribed on the table. But the table was kind of on the side. And you can see in this interior, for example, we're looking at that's the back door there. So we're standing like around the communion rail. But notice how prominent the podium, the pulpit is, because this was they didn't do a lot of ritual. There wasn't a lot of music there. It was mostly sing some simple hymns, and then the preacher gets up and talks for an hour or so. And so preaching was really big. And I tried to find a picture of an altar table. I couldn't find one because, well, here's the closest I got. Because here's a church, and you can see this would have been the communion rail during its Catholic days. And then kind of behind this pillar, behind this pier is the community. That's where it would end up being, but it's blocked from our view by this pillar. I wanted to point out, though, that a dog is peeing on the pillar. And you might think, wow, how did the Protestants ever deal with this kind of a painting, they thought that was fine. In a way, it reflects this religious iconoclastic mindset of the Protestants that, God is everywhere. The Catholics, they felt, had all these superstitious things about the bones of the martyrs and the bread and wine being sacred and all these crucifixes and holy statues and icons and so forth. And they just cleared all that out as superstitious claptrap, right? So to have a dog urinating in the church, oddly enough, was not something that upset the church, because they kind of agreed in a way that this is a meeting house for Christians to come together. It's not a holy sacramental place where these magical sort of things. They felt, anti-superstition. So it's interesting, something like this, we might at first misconstrue it and think, gee, how did the artist get away with this in a Calvinist? But it shows to a certain degree how liberal it was. Now, if you wanted to be Catholic, you could remain a Catholic, but you could not have a public face. And so there were some of these sort of, they're not really secret churches, they just don't have a facade. They were private chapels in rich people's homes who remained Catholic. And although they never gave any of the property back, when the Protestants took over, they took the property, they took the churches, they seized everything, monasteries, everything. And but if you wanted to raise your own money and support your own church, taxpayers' money goes to the state church, the Calvinist church, the Reformed church, whether you like it, believe it or not. That's, if you live there, pay taxes. But if you want to practice Catholicism, you can do that. And in fact, almost a quarter, almost 25%, 24, 23%, something like that, of the Dutch in the Netherlands, in the Protestant Reformed Netherlands, remained Roman Catholic during that time. So it's interesting. And here you can see how the altar is all very high and there's a painting above it and so forth. And now when you go to Amsterdam, you can go visit these little places where the Catholics met. The Jews were allowed to worship God more openly, and there were several synagogues, there were 2 or 3 synagogues in Amsterdam itself. And this was a welcome relief for Jews fleeing the persecution in Spain and Portugal, and to a lesser extent, Italy. And also from pogroms in the East, the Ashkenazic Jews coming from what is now Germany and Poland, East Europe. And the Ashkenazic and Sephardic had their own synagogues. And this is a Sephardic Portuguese synagogue. And it's still there. I mean, the Bema is still exactly as it is. But you may say, isn't it curious here in the synagogue that in the front, there's all these people that are not Jews. And we know they're not Jews because men and women are mixing. It even looks here like they're flirting a little bit. And they even bring their dogs into the synagogue. Well, who are these people in this vestibule? See, it's kind of a vestibule here, or a narthex, they call it in church. I don't know, the kind of the vestibule, the entryway. You come in there, and then you go into the sanctuary. And in the background, we can see here are Jews with prayer shawls. So there are the men and women are separate. There's no Reformed Jews. Everybody's Orthodox. So the men are on this side, the women, I suppose, are on this side. We can't see them. And all those people in the front are Christians watching because they thought it was curious and they thought it was interesting. And they sort of saw the Jews as their own past. They kind of imagined that that this reflected the religion of Jesus's time. And so they were very curious. Now, it's easy to, before I go into the art market, I want to say one more thing. It's easy for us to romanticize the Dutch. I love the Dutch. You gotta love them. They've been refugees, have come there during the Nazi Germany and everything else. They're wonderful, very tolerant. But we would be nice to imagine that the Reformed Church in Holland was just so tolerant and liberal that they thought there are many different ways to God. The Jews have one way, and Unitarians have another, and Catholics yet another. And that's not how they believe. In reality, they thought the Catholics and the Jews and the Lutherans, they're all going to hell unless they accept, the church. But, it's a big but, we're not going to make a Protestant Inquisition. If they want to practice their superstitious cults, we'll let them do it in freedom, as long as they don't insult the church and they don't, speak ill of the Reformed Church of the land. We'll tolerate them. They have to raise their own money if they want to exist, but we'll tolerate them. And so what happened was, as a result, and especially Amsterdam, but other places too, like Delft, became a center of dialogue, not only among different Christians and different Protestants, but also between Christians and Jews, and between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. So it was there was no place like it in Europe at that time for religious tolerance and freedom. Okay, so what else the Dutch brought us is a renewed art market. As I said, the market was booming, the economy was strong, and there was a heavy market. There was great demand for works of art. And the new thing that arises during the Dutch 1600s is really the birth of art galleries. Now, for the first time, we see gallery dealers who represent 12 or maybe even 20 different painters or sculptors or whatever. And so if you're a consumer of art, you have one-stop shopping, right? Because before the 1600s in the Netherlands, if you wanted a picture, you had to go to the workshop of the maestro and commission a picture to be made. There weren't any ready-made pictures, or at least that was a very small part of the market. You went and you commissioned each individual one. Now, and all you get to commission is that one artist, right? Each artist has his own. Most artists have their own. Sometimes there were partnerships. They basically have their own studios. Now, a dealer who takes a cut represents 12, 15 different artists. So if you're a consumer, you come in, you want something, say, I'd like a still life. He shows you one, you say, I'd like something with a little more blue in it because my wallpaper, whatever. And they said, well, you have another one like this, you see? So that it was a good thing for the consumer, because the consumer got to compare prices and skill of different people. All of them had been certified by Guild. They're all high quality. And so what happened was, you see, there were a lot of newly rich people because there was a booming economy. And so these people investing in art, buying art, was not only a good investment, but also because it will probably appreciate as if the artist becomes more famous as they get older. What was I saying? Lost my train of thought. But so there's a dealer who has several different artists and dealing it that way. And so what we begin to have, okay, I know what I was going to say, is that we have now ready-made artwork, right? Still lifes that are just produced for the market. We don't know who's going to buy it. The dealer is the one who bargains that out and gives the artist his cut, or rather takes a cut from the profit made by the artist. And they develop contracts, and they develop, exclusive contracts, so that such and such an artist would be represented by this dealer, and you couldn't show your things without permission of the dealer. So the whole modern art market was really born here, and it was a boom market. Okay, now, so there's a great demand for it. So what happens when there's high demand and little stock? The prices go up. So the prices got more expensive. And the next generation of Dutch people came in, they were teenagers, and they thought, geez, being an artist is lucrative. These people are getting rich quick. I'm going to apprentice myself to a maestro, and I'm going to become an artist. And so a whole generation of artists flooded the market. And because they flooded the market, there was surplus. And so the price of art came down, making it within the reach of middle-class people for the first time ever, right? So it snowballed. The demand rose, the prices rose, the artists flooded in. This we call the little Dutch masters. Unless you're an expert in 17th century Dutch art, nobody knows all of them. There's so many different ones. It was an incredible explosion of art, and the market really made this possible. Okay, so what this did is it made people, because they were just creating for a market, you don't know who's going to buy it, right? You just make kind of generic work. And so what we found is that we begin to see emerge distinct types of art, distinct genres, like still life, like landscape, and so allegory, and so forth. Okay, so let's take a still life by William Van Halen. And this is a breakfast, a very, very rich breakfast. And I must say, this is an absolutely gorgeous painting. The way he depicts surfaces is just absolutely incredible. And it's a very rich breakfast. Notice that there are oysters, which are expensive even then. And a little thing there to eat the oysters with. It looks like some of that challah, the sweet Jewish bread, that's been broken off and it became very popular, even among Gentiles. And look at how he paints the surfaces, the different surfaces of the pewter jug as compared to the brass wine glass, or the crystal water glass. And you know, it is the incredible reflections and refractions that happen in this glass of water. You can almost reconstruct how the studio looked. We can kind of place the windows. You see, all of that is reflected in this minutia of this incredibly rich verisimilitude. Look at the detail on here. Now, this shows richness in a couple different ways. Anyone that would own this painting would have to be kind of rich. It kind of implies that you have these kinds of things, although they weren't made from anybody's collection of things. They were just a still life that was made for the open market. And of course, you know, as I said, masters of naturalism. They didn't go for the drama of the Baroque as much as the naturalism of Caravaggio and the early Italians. But what I want to call your attention to here is the narrative content, because this breakfast has been disrupted. It looks like the, what do you call it? The jar, the pan, that the metal dish that held fruit, perhaps, has been knocked over. It looks like someone was eating this rich breakfast. They had only kind of partly peeled the lemon when they maybe had a terrible heart attack and fell over dead, right? And so this is what we call a memento mori, a reminder of death. It's okay to have all these nice things. Actually, having nice things, affording nice things, is a sign of God's beneficence and a sign that he thinks what you're doing is good, right? But don't get too attached to them, because you never know when death is going to come. And you're hoping that you're the elect. You're hoping that you're going to be struck dead right after communion or something like that. But you might not be. You might be having impure thoughts. You might be, doing something bad. And then you'd be caught in sin and you'd be among the damned rather than the elect. So there is a moral lesson. There's no religious imagery in the picture. It's a still life, but the implication of the presence of death and the fleeting richness of life. Okay. Here's a painting of flowers that some specialize just in flowers, and this is by Rachel Roach. And I want to point out the same memento mori goes for a painting like this, because there are insects in here that are devouring the plant, including a beautiful butterfly, by the way. But all of these plants, of course, they've been cut, so they're going to die. So that's also a memento mori. Now, one thing you'll note, here's another by the same artist, and you can see the bugs that are infesting the plant. So even while we see them in all their freshness and beauty, they're already beginning to decay. And the idea here is this is like our own beauty, our own youth. Don't get too attached to your fleeting beauty of the 20s, because as you get older, stuff happens, and that freshness fades, and you become old, and so forth. Okay, so don't get too attached to how you look, or to youth, because it will wither and so forth. It's passing. An important point here is it's a woman. Now, God bless the Dutch. They decided in their liberal, tolerant mindset that if women felt called to be artists, who are they to say they cannot? So in all of Europe, only boys could become apprentices, except the provinces of the Netherlands. Women could become apprentices and maestros. And often women did flowers. This was kind of a specialty. It was considered appropriate for women. But it's the first time we had women maestros. First time we have women entering the market on the same level. You know, it's wonderful. This tolerant form of Calvinism is very rich soil for art. Okay, landscape. This is Jacob Ruysdael, the great masters of family of arts. What I want to point out in this autumnal landscape is its naturalism. And we can see that especially if we compare it, let's say, to a French piece. This is by Nicolas Poussin, a French artist practicing in Rome. And he noticed the trees. The trees are very, but forget about the subject matter, but the trees are very, very idealized. The trees in the Dutch are much more like real trees. They're much less fluffy. They have imperfections in them. Notice the sort of bare spots in places. Some of the trees broken off and so forth. So there's more of less of a tendency to kind of clean up and idealize nature and just take nature raw and to just appreciate for what it is with all its imperfections and all its irregularities. But it also has a narrative content, always, because this, we see that there's a path. We're on a path and we're going to ford this little stream. I think there's a couple stones in it, and then we're going to continue. There's a little figure here to show us our scale, right? So we're on the path. We're on the path of life, right? So they all have this sort of metaphorical meaning. Also, the Netherlands are called the Netherlands because they're very low. They're the lowlands, the Netherlands, Nederland. And so there's terrible problems with flooding, because if the sea rises just a few inches, everything will flood. And so, but another result of this very flat landscape is these beautiful skies. And some of these Dutch masters like Ruysdael here is really able to get a wonderful emotions, almost romantic, out of the skies. Look at this one, this dark, day in winter, that sort of strange, almost kind of greenish light that can kind of take over just before a storm. It's going to be a heavy snowstorm, it looks like. And he's really captured the peculiarities of light, that particular kind of a glowing, usually around sunset, but if the clouds come in, can be even during the day. And he captures it wonderfully. Here, it's beautiful sky. It becomes almost an abstract painting as the wind blows the sea. But there's always a narrative element, almost always a narrative element, because we're kind of in that boat. Our life is kind of a choppy sea that we're trying to traverse. So there's always this kind of narrative element. Look at this one. This is absolutely beautiful. Moonlit. This moon is rising here, a full moon, illuminating the sky, just dimly illuminating this little village in the background. It's just as romantic as it can possibly be. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And you can see where the romantics of the 19th century, like Constable, like Turner, Caspar David Friedrich, others, turned to Dutch painting of the 1600s, because this is really a source of this deeply emotionally invested landscapes. Not just landscape as the background to some other thing, but landscape as a thing in itself, a whole expressive genre unto itself. Now let's take a landscape like this and go through the narrative, just show you the kind of Protestant kind of thing. So it looks at first just like, the romantic landscape with some ruins. But if I can talk you through it, In the left foreground, we have sheep and shepherds. We have two shepherds. One is standing up, he has a shepherd's crook. The other is sitting at his feet, looking up at him. And although they're shepherds and they're dressed in modern costume of the day, yet it suggests Jesus, because he said, I'm the good shepherd, and it decides kind of a discipleship. So even though it's showing the secular scene, it nonetheless has these religious overtones for those who are in the know. Now, on the other side, we see ruins. And there are ruins back here, too. This is a little part of a wall. Over here is part of it, and it's all overgrown. This perhaps suggests the young man, and I think of it as a man, because the artist was male. The young man is on the journey of life. Perhaps he leaves in a ruin his early dissipated life with his buddies, drinking too much, running after girls, different, gambling, smoking, these kind of vices. But then the good Calvinist must remain on that path, but he has to go through a dark period where it seems maybe there's no God, there's no kind of thing. The only thing to guide your way is that steeple of the church. So the church, the Reformed Protestant church, the Calvinist church, is your guide. This is where you look for your direction. This is your compass. And if you follow that path past the church, you emerge into light, into this field, this meadow of light with windmills and so forth. And so we have to pass through this time of temptation and darkness, and then eventually emerge in the light, given that we happen to be of the elect. We have to hope for them. It's our hope for the future. But it's also a troubled landscape in some ways. But it did have these connotations for the people of the time. We can appreciate it like it's a constable. We can appreciate it like it's a romantic landscape. But actually, it does have these religious overtones. So that, the idea that the Dutch kind of invented secular art, in a way that's true, but it's so invested with this Protestant kind of values that, okay, now, here's one called The Jewish Cemetery, also by Roysdale. And this, again, could be taken as kind of romantic, some ruins and so forth. But if you look carefully at it, there is a narrative, there's a Protestant narrative. In the foreground, we see a Jewish cemetery, but a Jewish cemetery is in ruins. A tree is broken over, dead. It looks like a flood has entered. Some of the tombstones are toppled over. And this to make sure that we understand there's a dead birch tree placed right in the right-hand side. So what he's saying here is Judaism, they were the chosen people at one time, and they were holy and they wrote the Old Testament, but then their religion sort of passed into oblivion, into the past. And now we're moving beyond that. So if you go to the middle ground, then we see the ruins of a Gothic church. And this represents, in the narrative, the way it's usually interpreted, the medieval Catholic past, right? Now in ruins after the Reformation. And the storm itself that has just passed are the storms of religion, of the Protestant revolt, of the Civil War that occupied the Netherlands in the first half of the 1600s. And then there's the rainbow. And the rainbow is the sign of the Protestants, that, just as Judaism and then Catholicism had been outmoded, now the storm has passed. God shows his beneficence with this rainbow. And remember what a problem flooding is in the Netherlands. And remember also that the rainbow was in the book of Genesis given as a sign that God will not destroy the earth with water again, as he did in Noah's time. So it's as if we've passed through these different phases of religious metamorphosis on our way to ultimate redemption, okay? So, needless to say, just does not agree with Jewish audience or a Catholic audience would take issue with this kind of a reading. But this is how it's meant. These memento mori, these narrative tales are very much imbued with a kind of religious sensibility. And you can appreciate it without that, just as sort of a romantic landscape. but it's more than that. Oh, good, portraiture. It'll take me a little longer. I might go a few minutes longer today because, and we're not even doing Rembrandt. Portraiture was the one thing where you did commissions because, people, well, usually they were also made ready-made portraits, which we'll look at. The greatest portrait artist was Franz Hals, and this is one of his arresting images. Notice how the figure, just like we had seen in Caravaggio earlier, breaks that fourth wall. It's as if we're in a conversation. He turns around to make a comment to us. Now, and so it has a great liveliness, as if it's happening at the moment. He's just turned around, he's noticed us, he makes eye contact, leans over the thing in a real, almost as if this is the frame of the canvas rather than the back of the chair. At first glance, especially in a slide, it looks like it's incredibly detailed embroidery, but it's not. It's really just slashing quick brush strokes because Hals started alla prima method of painting. Instead of glazing and stumbling and all these different layers, he'd do it all at once. He'd just start off with a ground color, of gray or brown or what, yellow ochre or whatever it was, and then would paint directly, wet in wet, in a slashing sort of brushstrokes. And this virtuosity of this quick brushstrokes is something that was very appreciated. He made a lot of money, became very rich. He was able to really create, through this brushiness, a sense of spontaneity and of liveliness. It's incredible. It's really incredible. He did very successful group portraits. Excuse me. Like this, and this was a confraternity, that is a men's club, right? Not like a golf club or something, but it's a confraternity. I think this confraternity is St. Andrew, so that they have their flag there. They probably had participated in the uprisings that led to the independence of the Netherlands. But these were like old war buddies getting together and dressing up with their sashes and everything, and they were a confraternity. So these men's clubs were very some of them were very exclusive. And he would paint, and each of the people would contribute money toward the group portrait. So he had to make sure that he made everybody look good. And he's pretty good at it, at staging these things. But he also does informal portraits that are just meant for the market, like this gypsy girl, who I think was a fishmonger, and he found her or whatever, and selling fish in the cart in the street. Reminds me of Molly Malone in the Irish folk tune. But again, he captures her with such rapid brushwork, just very slashing, very virtuosic, very, very quick. And this aspect would be very important to his followers, the Impressionists. The Impressionists really looked at Franz Hals because the brushiness and that spontaneity was very much part of it. Here's another one of these ready-made portraits called Bali Baba. And it's a barmaid. And she is really enjoying herself. And she has one of these huge stein of beer. Boy, you would really feel it if you drank that, I'm afraid. And look at the wonderful, in these informal portraits that are not commissioned, he's even more slashing and daring in his virtuosic brushwork. Like this face, it just, if you get in close, you can see it's just wet and wet. It's just very, very spontaneous. And look at her rotten teeth in there. And, and then she has this owl. An owl is a symbol. We think of owls wives, but in these days, the owl was witchcraft. It was the devil. So this may be her spirit familiar. She may be kind of a witch. But it does have a moral tale about it because, a young woman wouldn't want to end up like this. It would be better if you're a good Christian and you married a nice man and became a mother instead of being a barmaid. And Lord knows what other vices she has. She certainly has the vice of drinking far too much because she looks very intoxicated. Now, these very, very lively paintings went out of style. And although he made really good money at one point, he died in poverty as a ward of the state. And as part of his earning his keep while he lived in the poorhouse before he died, he did paintings. He did a painting of the regents, the women trustees, of the poorhouse. And he does them very unsympathetically. They look like horrible, judgmental, narrow, stupid, pretentious people. And it's like if he had to suffer the humiliation of dying in the poorhouse, he's going to make these people, not good. They're genre scenes. I could go on forever, but we're not even getting to Rembrandt until next time. One of Hall's most interesting pupils was Judith Leicht, and she also did she was very good at this alla prima method. And here in this jester, I guess it's a jester, he's that whimsical facial expression. And he's playing a lute. It's the ancestor of the guitar. But she also painted genre scenes like this of these two dissipated young men who've been drinking and smoking tobacco, and they're just having a great time. But in the background, who is it? A skeleton holding up an hourglass. You're mine, time will tell. Enjoy it while you can. And this again is a memento mori. This is saying leave behind these sorts of vices. God help you, or God feels sorry for you if you happen to fall down and break your neck and die in such a dissipated state, because you go straight to hell. That would show you're not one of the elect. And so a painting like this, that looks kind of enjoyable and fun, you could almost imagine it at a frat party or something like that. It does have a moral lesson that's very tried and true and very Protestant. Now, the greatest of the little Dutch masters, if we can even call him little in any way, is Johannes Vermeer. And Vermeer is one of he's usually with Rembrandt, he's considered one of the greatest of the artists of this century, of the 1600s. And he does genre scenes and landscapes. And here's one. This one has a very clear moral overtone. This man is paying this young woman for sexual favors. He already has his hand on her breast. His buddy is over there with a leering smile, kind of looking at us. The old woman in the back gets a cut. She kind of takes care of the women. I guess she's the sort of madame. She probably used to be a prostitute. And notice how pedestrian the prostitute's visage is. She's not a sympathetic character at all. She's definitely business, all business, cash on the line. Nothing's going to happen unless the coins appear in her very businesslike hand. And so the memento mori here is very clear, both for the women, either as prostitutes or as madams, or pimps, basically, or as young patrons and johns of paying for illicit sex, of which the church does not approve. And so it has these moral overtones. However, usually Vermeer is much less heavy-handed in his morality than in that last piece. He rises above it often. But even in a painting like this that we would think is pretty innocent, might have impropriety to it because there's no chaperone. A young woman meeting a young man alone without a chaperone present, he says, this is not a respectable kind of a thing. Now, there are some exceptions. It could be her brother. It could be her cousin, for example. That would be all right for them to be alone. And that, we can conjecture what it is. But even this may have some note of impropriety for the soldier here. It's at the Met. It's a very small painting. Gorgeous, jewel-like painting. Now, what I want to call attention to is that despite its kind of almost photographic realism, it distorts perspective. And we can see this most clearly in the man, the back of the man. He's too large in perspective to be sitting at the table across from this girl. It looks like she's near the corner of the table and he's sitting here. So look at him and then look at her, and she looks like she's several feet back. And this is because we believe Vermeer used this device called a camera obscura. Camera means room, obscura means dark. It's Italian, camera obscura. And what it is literally like a little black box that you can walk into. And here, for diagrammatic purposes, they've taken off that fourth wall, but you have to imagine very dark inside. And there's a lens over here that can be adjusted. Doesn't have a lot of depth of field, but you get this inverted image on the back if you focus it, of the back of the thing. Very light, but very photographic image. And we know now that he used them, that he used this device. And part of it is this sort of perspective distortion that we see happening, especially in the corners. Now, in photographs, this actually happens. And the reason is the retina, the back of the eye, is curved. Remember, the eye is round. The film in the camera is flat, right? And so images near the corners become distorted, like in the left-hand photograph. Now, luckily, we can correct this as in the right-hand photograph. This is taken from a photographic manual. Is what this picture is. It's not from the Broad. But I wanted to show you this because it's kind of like, I don't know. I remember when I was a kid, we used to have those Mercator maps. And remember where Greenland was as big as South America, you know, and it's because because it was projected on a flat surface. So that's the kind of effect that we see here. And once I've called your attention to it, you notice it. We notice it less because photographs do this and we're used to the language, the visual language of photographs. So there's definitely a photographic quality. You can see it in paintings like this, you know. He also does pure landscape like this, view of Delft. He was from Delft, he wasn't from Amsterdam. There's only like 30 Vermeers, 32, 33, there's not very many, they're very rare. He was very slow. He also was a tavern owner. He owned a tavern and you know, an inn. And so that's where he made most of his money. So he could afford to not paint very much. And his work was appreciated by connoisseurs, but not as much as it is now. This has an unmistakable photographic quality. It's just amazing. Now, the theology kind of behind this is that, well, I don't need angels and Mary floating up into heaven and all the orchestra and chorus and so forth. If we just look naturally at the world, it's filled with light. It's God's divine presence made visible, you see? So there's even a theology in this photographic naturalism, a belief that the world is beautiful despite the sinfulness of human nature, that nature itself is beautiful and pristine and an expression of God's grace. And so we see this here. There's a little narrative going on, little clouding skies begin to hint at some disturbance of this otherwise very peaceful scene. And here we can also see other photographic remnants, and I'm hoping you'll indulge me for another 5 minutes because I want to finish up Vermeer. And if you have to leave early, I understand, but I'm on a roll. In this one, we see not perspective distortion, but we see a phenomenon that in photography is called circles of confusion. Let me zero in a little closer here. You see these circles here, see the things here, these dots. These, the camera sees, but the eye does not see. We recognize this because we're used to photographs. Photographs do that. Certain details are blurred and they just become kind of circles. It's like circles of confusion. We can't quite focus in, and so it gives us these dots. Now, the eye does not see this way. Photography, however, this is a phenomenon. And so this clinches it. Although he never speaks or writes or anything about using a camera obscura, from looking at these photographic techniques that the eye just does not see, it's apparent that he used this drawing device. Now, that does not mean that, you know, he's just it's a mechanical thing that he uses, he traces things. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Jimmy's Vermeer or something. This guy tried to copy Vermeer by using camera obscura. And it didn't look like a Vermeer. I mean, very roughly, it was a Vermeer. It's not, the drawing device is just a way of visualizing things. It takes an incredible technician, not just anyone copying, but an incredible technician to have the slight, fuzzy, soft blurring quality. And look at this is the carved lion's head on the chair. And look at how it's just reduced to these sort of dots. And you can see the Impressionists, they go right on this. They're looking right at this. This is one of their main guys. And you know, he's really is a precursor. And it's interesting, it took 300 years, the 1600s and 1900s, for artists like the Impressionists and the Romantics to really pick up on what they had pioneered in the Dutch. Okay, I'm going to speed it up now, but these are some beautiful little paintings here of a maid, I guess, cleaning up and opening the windows. Here's a very little painting of a lace maker. It really shows the intense concentration necessary for the lace maker. Beautiful painting just called mysteriously The Letter. There's this pregnant woman, she's reading a letter. You can't help thinking, what kind of news is it? And you really can't guess from her face. She looks kind of surprised, but it's indistinct exactly if this is good news, if this is bad news. And he leaves the whole painting sort of pregnant, if you know what I mean, pregnant with mystery, pregnant with anticipation. We want to know what's in the letter, and yet we never know. But look at the sense of light. Look at the beautiful natural light. And you know, he did most of the things with a few props of that map and these certain chairs that he rearranges endlessly. I want to, my favorite painting by Vermeer is this one, Woman Weighing Gold. And again, they're all small, very quiet genre scenes. It's a wealthy woman, I guess she's weighing out with a scale of gold, filled with symbolism, filled with a mystical and Protestant kind of illusions. In the background, we see a painting of the Last Judgment. And so this puts the woman on the level of Christ. She also is judging. And look at how beautifully he does it. It's if he's just breathed the color onto the canvas. It's just absolutely immaculate. And calls to mind, of course, the Virgin Mary and her pregnancy with Christ and all that sort of stuff, although it's not. It's like the shepherds and the other one. It's an illusion, but not a literal storytelling. You have to kind of deduce this from the thing. So she has kind of a Mary sort of quality to her with her pregnancy, and it makes you wonder what is her story. But also she has to use judgment, because remember that the fetus that is in her womb is already tainted with original sin from conception. And so she'll realize that part of her duties as a mother is to weigh good and evil, to teach ethics and morality and good, Christianity to her children. And of course, she has great riches. And this is another symbol of Christianity, but not the riches of the outward kind, but riches of the inward kind. Jesus says, don't save up things in the real world, but store up treasures in your soul, in your innermost being. And so she's kind of in her little chamber. This is like her. And she has great riches, but she's not ostentatious about it. She's not loud. She's not proclaiming her wealth in this sort of way. Also notice the light is sort of blinded by a thing. And this is an allusion to Paul. Paul says, we see thee now, talking about God, we see thee now as through a glass darkly. See only glimpses and murmur, but after death, we'll see thee face to face. And so this is a darkened and shows our contemporary, our own corporal present, right? Not the beyond that is suggested by the Last Judgment and by the still life objects. Also, there's a mirror which conjures up, the possible vice of vanity, right? And reflects the room. They're very rich still life, including pearls. And there's a couple of stories that Jesus tells of a woman who loses a very costly pearl, and she cleans the whole house just to find that one pearl. And so God threshes through a bunch of mediocre people to find that one true gem of a true Protestant Christian. But also, Jesus says, don't cast your pearls before swine. That is, if they don't accept what you're trying to teach them, kick the dust off your shoes and move on. And don't throw your pearls before swine. So all these allusions, not illusions, but allusions to various texts in the Bible contributes to what appears to be an ordinary everyday life scene. But part of the story here with Dutch naturalism is the scene, the material, the natural is a manifestation of God's presence everywhere, not just in angels, not just in saints, not just in the church, not in any holy relics or anything, in lived existence. Two minutes, 1 minute. These new Vermeers appeared in the market in the 30s, and they looked real. And they were traced back to a man named Van Meegeren, who was a dealer, a Dutch art dealer, and he did them himself. And he was himself a failed painter, and he sold them to the Nazis. So when the Nazis were cast off, they arrested Van Meegeren, saying that you had sold national treasures to the Nazis. And he said, I never sold them a painting, I didn't make them myself. And the expert said that Van Meegeren is a 10th grade painter. He never could have possibly executed these beautiful, these are authentic Vermeers. And they proved it by taking, turpentine and trying to wipe it. If a painting is a couple hundred years old, if you take turpentine and you wipe it, you will get maybe some dirt, but you won't get color. If a painting's only 50 years old or only 10 years old, if you take a little turpentine, color will come off. What Van Meegeren did is there were these new kind of like precursors to acrylic plastic paints that had just come out of the market. And he mixed them in with the oil paint. And then he baked them in the oven, in his oven, like cookies. And then they became really hard and they were impervious to the turpentine. And so he made another Vermeer. It is in the background. Another Vermeer in prison, in jail, waiting for a sentence. And then he declared that he was just a forger. He wasn't treason. And forgery is not nearly as serious an offense as treason is, as selling national treasures to the Nazis. This is Van Meegeren down here, seeming to have being at the end of his rope. He was found guilty, but he was only sentenced to a year in prison. However, he died of a heart attack within a month after his trial and was never actually made it to prison. Well, I'm sorry I went over. There's a lot more because we didn't even talk about Rembrandt. I mean, Rembrandt is he's a whole nother can of worms. And so we're going to look at Rembrandt, especially his naturalism takes the form of utilizing the Jews of Amsterdam as his subject matters in recreating his life of Christ and of the saints. He's a great religious painter of the Dutch Protestants. And if you want to see more stuff that I'm doing, you can look me up here.